I wonder sometimes that the areas where there's some differences in organizations, like you talked about, Sean, or those areas of rub where there's different mandates or different philosophies, do you find yourselves feeling like in order to do what you need to do for the sake of the youth that are advising you, you're kind of standing between sometimes the demands of your organization or the reporting requirements of your organization, or whatever the case is, and then there's you, and then there's what you're trying to do based on what the youth are requiring or asking for?
If you don't have that voice that's contrary to your process, then the conflict doesn't exist. So if you have a conflicting view on something, that's the only way that it might actually change or shift. So I think it's probably the most important part of the integrated youth services, as well as bringing everybody to the table.
I'm not in an active teaching role, but so much of what Brandon University Master of Education in Administration and Leadership has offered me applies, and the practicum is like times 20.
We are here today with Leaning In and Speaking Out, the Research Connection podcast. I am Jackie Kirk, and I am from the Department of Leadership and Educational Administration at Brandon University, and one of the co-hosts of the podcast. Today we're talking about Huddle Brandon, and we have a couple of guests on our show. I'll let the three of you introduce yourselves, and Sean, maybe we'll start with you.
Yeah, my name is Sean Funk. I am the director of Huddle Brandon, and I work with Westman Youth for Christ here in Brandon.
And I'm Chris Bromley. I am the director of mental health for Prairie Mountain Health.
And I'm Michelle Lamb. I'm the co-host of the podcast and the director of BU Cares Research Center.
Okay, so let's just jump right into the questions, and let's start out with explaining to everyone what Huddle is. Chris, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, sure. That sounds good. So Huddle is a initiative that's from the Shared Health and the Department of Mental Health, Wellness and Recovery in Manitoba, and it comes through the United Way in Winnipeg. And it is a model that follows similar international models of integrated youth services. So it's taking mental health and addiction services and coupling them with social services, with recreation services, and all having them in one place, and specifically to have low barrier, easy access to those services so that youth can change the way that they access services, not need to go to all sorts of different places, and be able to access it all in one place with that low barrier in mind. That's the key for the whole service. The other piece that's integral in the integrated youth services, which it is at Huddle Manitoba and Huddle Brandon, is that you require a youth voice in the design and implementation of the services. So a youth advisory committee at minimum is required as part of that model to be able to integrate those services, so that you know that you're actually reaching the people that you want to reach with the intended services that you provide. So in Brandon, that's located on Rosser Avenue. It's a community collaborative partnership between many different agencies in Brandon, including Prairie Mountain Health, Youth for Christ, Brandon Friendship Center, the Career and Employment Youth Services. Addictions Foundation of Manitoba is an early partner, but they are now part of Prairie Mountain Health. So the services within AFM are now part of Prairie Mountain Health anyways. And we meet and CERC and well, there's lots of different partners that we can get into, but you would have a clinical advisory, youth advisory, and then you try to bring those things together to make sure that you serve youth. The other key piece for integrated youth services is that you transition that 18-year-old gap. So instead of transitioning services at an arbitrary number of age 18, the services are from 12 to 29 and available to youth.
Oh, so it sort of bridges across that gap.
Yes.
Oh. That's an important piece in our community, as we've been learning. One of the last podcasts that we did was about homelessness in rural Manitoba, and we talked about all the gap as students sort of aged out of some of the programs.
If you think of the number of services in a school, so you never get as many social and mental health and addiction services as you do as a youth, and people wrapped around and cared for you. And an arbitrary number of 18 does not make sense for transitions of particular services. So this is part of that transformation of the system. So a small part of transformation of the system to be able to move to serve people in a better way.
Mhm.
And so your role on Huddle, Brandon, is to represent Prairie Mountain Health.
Yeah, so I hold a couple hats within Huddle, Brandon. So I'm not the only representative for Prairie Mountain Health. Part of this was that I was one of the initial people to bring it to the table to develop the proposal to bring it to Brandon, and part of that was also some commitment to Prairie Mountain Health of some time, as well as my time within clinical advisory types of roles and that type of thing. So that's my role, but then there's also leadership and staff from a couple different programs within Prairie Mountain Health as well who attend and provide the service. So I don't provide the service, but I do a bit more of the advisory and working with Sean and Dwayne and Gail and Eva, and I'm going to miss somebody's name, which is the trick of not listing names, but I provide more of a clinical advisory role with that, and Jamie as well.
But we know it's a small kind of town because all the first names that you just mentioned, I knew who you were talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
So we know it's a small town
Yeah.
when that happens.
Yeah.
One of the benefits of when we did the proposal is I saw the call out. I called all those people, we sat down and figured out how we were going to bring it to Brandon together. And that was I think that was the key in the development of our specific iteration of Huddle, was that it was community minded from the beginning. And we don't have to backtrack and try to bring the community in afterwards.
And Sean, you did your practicum at Huddle. So do you want to talk a little bit about how that worked as a practicum and maybe how that impacted the project and talk about things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, as the director of Huddle, Brandon, like, I guess I've been tasked with kind of implementing on the ground kind of all of these IYS or integrated youth service principles and bringing all the pieces together. So one of these principles include kind of like co-design and delivery, governance and evaluation of programming and services with youth and their families and community partners and the clinical kind of folks that are coming to there to deliver the service. And because Huddle, Brandon, is about not just low barrier and access for youth, but about transforming the system. The youth voice is very necessary for that to happen, but it's also really necessary to have all of our service providers around the table speaking into the design as well. If they're not around the table, then the system doesn't change. So when I heard about the practicum at Brandon University, I was like, well, I need to work on this anyway. This is part of my role in my job, and I need some help, I think, in both form, like in structure of doing this, which the practicum is helpful for, giving me some structure around what are my goals, how am I going to work on this, and then also some mentorship, which Chris provided, being with Prairie Mountain Health and having experience in leadership in working with individuals from different agencies that don't like officially report to him, which is a necessary skill in my role at Huddle. I'm working with service providers from 6, 7, 8 different agencies. There's 30 of them, once we get up and going, and I don't have direct, kind of hierarchical influence influence. I need to lead more by influence than by command, right? So that was kind of the appeal in the practicum, is learning from Chris and pulling together this clinical advisory committee of those that are going to be providing the services there in a way that's going to match what we provide to what the youth
Yeah.
need.
So without the
Um,
structure of the practicum, would you have gone about it in the same way? Like
Absolutely not.
I had the opportunity to read your journal and
Mhm.
things like that, but was that process valuable for you?
Yeah, like I found, I mean, it kind of felt a bit wrong at the beginning that I was doing work that I was going to do anyway, and then getting school credit for it. But I think it gave me, like I said, a lot more form or structure around what I was intending to do. So, I mean, I sat down with you, Jackie, and we talked about what would be my goals. How would I know that I met them? And I don't think I would have been that intentional from the outset with forming a clinical advisory committee. I would have just made a few phone calls, and it wouldn't have been as intentional as it would have been from the beginning. And then as we tracked along, then there was even just the documenting was a lot more than I normally would do day to day. But it was good because all that work that I was doing for school gave, I think it was just better outcome at the end because I was that much more intentional with it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think from the other perspective is having it as a practicum, right? Because it was things that Sean and I needed to do, or as a group needed to do. But when it's a task, and you do a task. This required quite a bit more reflection to be able to meet the expectations of the other piece. And the more we were able to reflect on it together to say, okay, if we do this, then these are the consequences, or if we do this, so let's try to meet these barriers head on, and then reflect on what's going to be the best piece. So I do think even from a service provision point of view, having a framework of having somebody mandated and required to reflect on his practice helps with that kind of process. So everybody's busy, everybody's got lots going on. So a task is a task. Some tasks require more reflection and deliberate process than others. And this was one that is iterative. It should continue. There should be development ongoing as needs change, as people come. So if you build a rigid system off the beginning, you're going to end up with a rigid system in the end. So I do believe this had a mutual benefit as well.
I think it's really fascinating what you just said about leadership and that idea of you were working with all of these community partners or working with all of these agencies, but you weren't really in a hierarchical relationship with them. So when you think back about that time, what has being involved with Huddle taught you about interagency collaboration or communication? Any of that?
Yeah. Well, two things immediately kind of come to mind for me. One is that there's a big appetite in Brandon, and I think there has been for a while, for working together on, kind of big systemic problems, right? And mental health for youth has been something that's been really highlighted coming out of the pandemic. All our systems are overwhelmed. Schools are overwhelmed. CATC is overwhelmed, right? And we want to change that. So I think when I don't have to do much convincing. I found, right, that I don't have to do much convincing when I'm talking to folks that there is a problem and we want to fix it, right? So, and we think that we can do it better when we engage more people. The other thing that kind of has taught that this has taught me is that we all do come to our work in very different ways. So as much as there's an appetite for change and wanting to, we naturally do what we do by default because it works where we are. And when we come together in a public space that no one owns exclusively, then we're going to run into like, oh, this works at my place, and this works at my place, and this works at my, and then it can become disorienting. What do we do here? Now there is some help with youth voice in that, right? Like youth are saying, this is what we need, right? So it can be orientating to have that kind of the youth voice doing that. And there can be a little bit of like negotiation that goes on as well as we try to figure this out together. We'll try some things that are not going to work. So I think interagency collaboration has to be come at from the angle of, I have something to offer here, but I'm not the expert on how all things go here. I need to hold what I offer with an open hand, and we all need to be orientated around what youth need, and we're going to try things that are not going to work, and then we're going to make adjustments. That's what I'm learning so far.
It can be a fun puzzle piece aspect of, because everything is a bureaucracy in a way, and everybody's got their ways of going forward. But sometimes if you don't recognize why certain things exist, you can miss the very valid reason why that exists or why that process exists. So generally accepting everybody's friction and barriers as, okay, why are they there and what could we do with that, allows you not to make the mistakes of the past at the same time, but also lets you go head on. So we've had some pretty straightforward conversations about, well, I don't think I believe that's a barrier that we should try to address. And another agency says how they've gone around that barrier. As Sean was saying, you can hear how people have worked around those things, and you end up getting a better product than if one agency by themselves just sat down and said, this is what we're going to provide, and you give us space for it, which could have been the easy way, right? I have a space, you come use it. But we're intentionally trying to say, okay, who are we trying to serve, and when and why, and what types of things do we want to input?
So I think we see some tensions around agencies that have lots of power potentially, and are often run by white leaders. And how do we do a good job of offering services for youth who are often racialized and have different experiences in life than what we have? And that leads us to a question of positionality and your own positionality, and how, in some ways, maybe how you can overcome the positions that you take up within the community and become leaders that offer services to Indigenous youth, for example, that will be truly supportive for them, and that they will feel welcome there and feel like they belong within that space.
Yeah, the positionality question is a great one, because we all come at the world from where we sit, right? Where we, whether we're white or Christian, working with a, Christian organization, Christian organizations, churches have not been welcoming in the past to Indigenous populations, for sure, right? Been part of colonization. That's terrible. So it's a very valid question. I think what Huddle offers is an acceptance of that we all have our own positionalities, and there's potentials in that positionality and limitations, right? I as a white Christian identifying male have some, or man, have some potentials in that I hold some authority, whether it's earned or unearned, all right, in our society, and I can use that for good or for ill, and I'm going to represent ill no matter what I do to some folks, and what I think Huddle offers, though, is that we are orientated around the needs of youth, and it's not owned by any one organization. So then it's not limited by that organization's potential or positionality either, or those people's, right? So we really are, we as organizations here that are bringing Huddle into existence, are really dependent upon each other to do the best work that we can do for the youth that we are best positioned to serve. We need Indigenous agencies to serve Indigenous youth and to become Huddle for become the welcoming place for those Indigenous youth. We need Prairie Mountain Health to offer clinical services that none of our other agencies are able to offer. I can't, at Westman Youth for Christ, we can't offer clinical services at the level that Prairie Mountain Health is able to. And we need to listen to each other on where our positionalities might be getting, or ways of working might be getting in the way of welcoming youth that are trying to access service or need to access services. I think we run into problems when one agency tries to do all of what they want to do because it limits, like they have potentials, but they also have limitations. And this allows for a way that we can kind of get into all of them that becomes welcoming for youth.
In your journal with your practicum, you were starting to look into building your base with elders in the community.
Right.
And you were doing some reading to try to help yourself to be more open. Can you tell me where that's gone? Like even what you wrote in your journal, but where it's gone since then is what I'm interested in. I already know the background.
You didn't know your journal was going to become public.
I did not know my journal would become public. Yeah,
well, I really like that part though. Like
Right.
I think even your intention of choosing that as a topic in your journal is an illustration of your openness to learning and your recognition of your limitation there.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what I saw modeled even with Chris and his intention of looking at Indigenous ways of healing and wellness within more of a Western institution that is our healthcare system, right? Like what are ways that we can embrace and I think when I started doing some reading around Indigenous perspectives and colonization, and this has been a longer journey, but like even through the practicum, it was a recognition again that I cannot be all things to all people, and I need to be open to hearing from those that might have very different perspectives and ways of doing life than I do, and facilitating. I think Huddle can help kind of facilitate that for me personally, but I think also for all of us trying to be helpful in our community. I haven't done enough in connecting with elders or other Indigenous leaders and those involved in healthcare. We do have quite a strong relationship with Brandon Friendship Center and some of their staff there, and we've started since the practicum, we started offering some Indigenous perspective workshops on ready to work, ready to rent, that are way more narrative based, way less workshop-y. It's telling stories and having Indigenous folks come in and share with youth on how they've been able to find success in finding housing or work and jobs. And I think we need to be open to that, even though that wouldn't be the way I would go about educating young people.
And to give Sean a bit of a break and saying I haven't done enough is that there's never like an end point to that kind of journey where it's not a checkbox. We're being pretty intentional in making it not a checkbox, and that there's newcomer youth and there's Indigenous youth, and we have specific conversations about who may be underserved and how can Huddle fill some of those gaps. The integrated youth service has a way, like one of the intentions of bringing everybody to the table is to take that positionality and flatten the playing field a little bit more, to make it more of an equal decision-making framework. And that's the intent of bringing the youth to it as well, because youth don't get involved in the decision-making framework very often. So integrated youth services is a good model to try to do that, to say, okay, how do we know if we're actually building what is needed? Sean and I also used the Indigenous Wellness Continuum from the Thunderbird Partnership as a basis of our discussions and some of our thought process with the Clinical Advisory Committee to have those discussions about who and when and why. So using a framework that has been developed as an Indigenous wellness framework, it allows us to think a bit differently, as opposed to our, here's my boxes, here's my steps, here's my tiers, this is how I'm going to do it. And I always go there. I love tiers and boxes and diagrams.
Right.
And I made a diagram for this, don't get me wrong, but using a bit of a different philosophy and development, and it's never going to be perfect. And that's why it's an iterative process, just to continue with it. But you have to start somewhere, and you need to be intentional with what those baseline building blocks, to make sure you're not making yourself building blocks, literal building blocks out of the service.
I really appreciate what you both said about the voices of the youth being primary in the advisory board for Huddle. And I think that having those youth as the kind of bottom line of, are we being successful in the things that we're doing, makes total sense given what I've now learned about Huddle. I wonder sometimes that the areas where there's some differences in organizations, like you talked about, Sean, or those areas of rub where there's different mandates or different philosophies, do you find yourselves feeling like, in order to do what you need to do for the sake of the youth that are advising you, you're kind of standing between sometimes the demands of your organization or the reporting requirements of your organization, or whatever the case is, and then there's you, and then there's what you're trying to do based on what the youth are requiring or asking for? How would you describe that, or how would you talk about that? And maybe just more broadly, the things that you're learning about leadership in this journey of setting up Huddle. It's a pretty broad question, but I hope that made sense.
I'll let Sean take most of it, but I'll just say that that's the important part of the transformational change that we want, is if you don't have a catalyst for that change, if you don't have that voice that's contrary to your process, then the conflict doesn't exist. So if you have a conflicting view on something, that's the only way that it might actually change or shift. So I think it's probably the most important part of the integrated youth services, as well as bringing everybody to the table, is that there's going to be friction, there's going to be conflict, but that's how you change your ideas. That's how you think of new ways, and it's the catalyst for it, is what I would say.
Yeah, Huddle is really, you stole my answer.
Just say it again and I'll split it. And then
but that's like system. If the point of Huddle is system transformation for youth, low access, low barrier, then there has to be friction within organizations if that's not currently the reality. And it's not. We're hearing that time and time again. So there has to be times that I and my organization are at odds with each other, and we have to work through, what does this mean? And if this is better for youth, which is what Youth for Christ is about, if we're here, right? If this is better for youth, then what's stopping us from changing our system? And I think that's true. I hope that's true in every organization that partners at Huddle, is that they have staff that are willing to stand in that space between what youth need and what the organization is currently practicing or requires, and could be for very good reasons, but there needs to be tension there. I think so.
Yeah.
And there's some simple examples of who should hire this position. And there's certain organizations that have certain needs or requirements. So I work for Prairie Mountain Health, which is a large organization, and hiring and it's a unionized environment, and HR, it's a very different area. So we're hiring or working on bringing positions on from Prairie Mountain Health that fit that kind of environment and require that kind of structure. And then there's other areas where it's, well, we need this kind of expertise or influence, or this kind of expertise or influence, and Huddle and Sean have that ability to say, okay, well, this is what the youth say we need, and this is how we can get that, and this is how we can make it make sense. And so I think that's been a great benefit for who brings what to the table. Let's use the best of that.
So maybe you would tell us a little bit about the timeline for the process and your plans, and then talk to us about, in the amount that you've progressed so far, what has surprised you within that time frame?
Well, I came on last year in October, so Chris could talk best about like from the beginning, and then I could pick it up later.
I was going to give you a hard time and say Sean wanted to go faster.
Oh yeah. Oh, I do. I have it right here. I do want to go faster.
He'll get there. That he would like it to go faster for sure. But this is a pretty monumental task, and my hope is that this is just a small version of what the next step and the next step are. So they've announced 2 additional huddles in Manitoba already, so that'll bring it up to 8, I believe. So the hope is that this is, like, there are needs in the mental health and addiction system that need to be filled, and this is one of those needs that with expansion can be very beneficial to everybody. But the timeline from kind of proposal to now, I always look at things the same way, and I'm like, well, I got to get these tasks done, I need to move it along. But situations like this, the time is important and the intention is important, and if we rushed into something, then we'd make a couple of mistakes that could affect reputation or affect how people access it. So I feel like we're in a pretty good place for the timeline and where we've developed. There are a consistent list of services being provided at Huddle. We're working to integrate what that means and how do you get to those things, right? It needs to have some navigation to it and all those pieces, but that piece, like, each piece builds on top of each other piece, and everything is intersecting in some way that it doesn't happen really quickly. And I would say that each huddle in Manitoba has gone through quite a different process in how to get there. But that's kind of the beauty of the model too, is that you can take a local perspective on what the needs are and develop from there. So on one hand, I would say it would be great to have everything flushed out and everything good to go, and we were just operating, but that doesn't build that intentional continual change that's required to make sure you're meeting the needs, as opposed to, okay, it's developed, run it. Okay, well, it might always feel like we're developing it. It may never feel like it's done. And getting to that thought process is difficult for me, just to say, okay, that task is done, but I have a feeling this is one of those, if you're doing it right, you always feel like you're growing and developing the program as you move forward.
Yeah, some of the things I found surprising, I think in my first year, it's just over a year since I started in the director role, is that it takes a lot longer than I thought it would. I thought I'd be able to have a couple conversations and we could start moving things along. And I just have a great example of this that happened today. I started a conversation with an organization about 2 months ago, and wanted a Huddle peer supporter to be able to meet with the youth that were going to this place. And then that would form a relational bridge to some of the services that we provide that they don't. And we don't want to duplicate what they're already doing, so then we can be in that space at the same time. And just yesterday, I got an email, hey, we're looking ahead to our schedule in January. When can a Huddle peer supporter be here consistently? And I'm like, oh, that took 2 months, right? And I thought it would be one conversation, and it was, but there was some more engagement in between. But that's kind of how Huddle works. Like, people love the idea when they hear about it. Then they have to think about, oh, how does this look within what's our role? What's your role? How is this going to look? And it takes time, and and me being okay with that is the biggest problem in all of it, I think. The other thing that I think has been a bit of a surprise for me, just in talking to other IYS sites across Canada, specifically Kelowna, Vancouver, and one in Kenora, is that they all experienced like a flood of youth and just huge demand when the doors were open, and we haven't had that here. I don't know why. I mean, we're also opened like basically at the end of the pandemic. It was still kind of almost locked, or just came out of lockdown in May with grand opening. So some of that I think plays into it. Some of it might be our location. Some of it's just getting the name out there, the word. And I think that's actually okay, again, because we're slowly building and able to make adjustments without the frantic day-to-day of, I don't know how to manage this volume. I think we'll get there yet, though. So
I think we require a little bit of that too, because that's a bit of the youth advisory by itself, is that you can build for what you think is going to come, and then when things come, that's the iteration where you change again.
right.
So you get to 20 youth where you're like, well, I didn't think that was going to happen. So let's do the next stage. Let's see how we can fill that need.
Yeah.
So if you could give some advice to new students that are maybe heading into a practicum, maybe not, what would your advice be? And Chris, you can feel free to jump in as well from the supervisor if you've got advice. Okay.
I would say please don't make this a make work project for yourself. Like, look at what you are already doing and you want to grow in, or look at something that you want to grow towards. Maybe there's a staff or a supervisor that you find their practice like helpful or appealing or compelling, and you want to learn more with, like, find a way to sit with them and reflect on your own practice, or learn about what they are doing, that will help you in engaging kids or whatever kind of your work is. What I've loved about BU all along is I'm not in an active teaching role, but so much of what Brandon University Master of Education in Administration and Leadership has offered me applies, like, and the practicum is like times 20 because I can shape it. So I'd say, like, take full advantage of the work you're already doing or want to do, and find a practicum that's going to complement that.
It's a good advertisement for your program.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wouldn't, like, as far as advice goes, I'm not in a position for that, but I generally, anytime somebody does something that they have either an extreme curiosity or passion for, then it's just going to be much more enjoyable and go for it.
Agreed.
One of Sean's strengths is that he can be curious about whatever he's doing at that time. But if you have a curiosity or a passion for something, then that's going to definitely make your practical much more worthwhile.
That's good advice. Thanks, Chris.
So one more question.
Yeah.
For teachers working within the education system, how would they recommend or sort of channel students with needs towards Huddle?
Just reach out. So, I mean, they can connect with it. We're a youth serving agency that are very youth focused. Our youth advisory committee is very active on Instagram. So we're on Instagram and Facebook, and a lot of our youth referrals are coming like just direct messages on Instagram, and we want to be that low barrier. So any way that works best for a teacher, a youth, we are answering that call and or answering that message, whatever that looks like. So email, Facebook, Instagram.
If we do this right, there won't be a wrong door to get there. And
Yeah.
no matter where you go, because it's supposed to be integrated, you're going to get the right service at the right time in the right places. So eventually, hopefully that's not a question that needs to be asked. It's just a complete integration into the system. But that's the point, is the low barrier, being able to access. One of the things that Sean, one of the connections he has made is that we do an integrated teen clinic in the high schools in Brandon specifically. So making that direct connection back is really important, and it's kind of like drawing the web of where you can go and then what's the next step. And Huddle serves as a really great place to be the center of that, to be able to draw those lines that, you know, we don't have what you need, but we know exactly where to go to get what you need as well. The integration or the connection between all those services is important, and the school division is a large portion of the mental health and addiction system for kids. So it's an important connection to be able to have.
So we'll link to all your social media in the
Perfect.
notes to the show so that anybody who's listening can click and go.
Yeah, great.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much. This has been a great conversation. I enjoyed it a lot.
Good.
I had heard of Huddle. I think I read about it in the Brandon Sun a few months ago, but I didn't know very much about it. So I learned a lot, and appreciate your thoughts around interagency collaboration and leadership. Enjoyed it a lot. Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.